afternoon, everybody. Nice to be with you again today. For the next hour, we'll talk about a negotiation concept that I have been studying and developing in my own practice over the last few years. And this goes back to the idea that most people in negotiations and in mediations focus on BATNA, which most are familiar with if you've read Getting the Yes or any negotiating books or taken a course on negotiation. And that's your best alternative to a negotiated arrangement, or BATNA, best alternative to a mediated arrangement if you're in mediation. But what often doesn't get discussed, and I think is more effective, is having folks focus on what is not necessarily your worst case scenario or worst case alternative to a settlement, but what's your realistic exposure to a catastrophic outcome? And that's what we're going to talk about today. This is my own phrase. I'm thinking about trademarking it. RECO, realistic exposure to catastrophic outcomes in negotiations, including mediations. And I'll walk through some of the slides here. We'll show you the agenda for today and the material that we're going to cover. We're going to do some case studies, a little bit of audience participation, and hopefully you'll get something out of it by the end of the seminar. This is a little graphic here that you can download and use in your own practice. Again, material that we created, but we're happy to share with you. And our agenda for today is, after we get beyond the introduction, we'll talk about the psychology behind why RECO works, what it's based upon. It's rooted in solid psychology, human behavior, economics, and experience. And we'll talk about how you apply these concepts in your own negotiation, look at some case studies, and give you some takeaways from the seminar. So I like this quote here that, or the statement, I should say. It's not a quote. This is my own statement. The best negotiations aren't about winning every point. They're about making the other side realize that they can't afford to lose. And that's what this is based on, is when we're in a high stakes negotiation, making the potential losses tangible for counterparts in a negotiation, to realize that most often, and I'd say in my mediation practice, 4 out of 5 cases settle in mediation. Maybe the numbers are a little better than that. I've been doing that for a few years now. I do anywhere from about 5 to 10 mediations a month over the last couple of years. And most settle, often not because people come into a mediation thinking they're looking for a settlement, but because they realize they can't afford to leave without one. The certainty of a settlement agreement often far outweighs the unknown risks that folks face if they have to go forward in litigation, or if they have to go forward in some type of uncertain business dispute. So as I mentioned at the outset, RECO stands for realistic exposure to a catastrophic outcome. And it helps our negotiation counterparts visualize what they truly stand to lose by shifting the dynamic of the negotiation away from a best alternative to a what are my real risks that I face here if I don't reach an agreement. It's rooted heavily in loss aversion and prospect theory. Prospect theory is popularized by in economics and behavioral economics by Kahneman in his books, and Daniel Kahneman and his negotiation, or his counterpart in a lot of the studies that he engaged in behavioral economics, Tversky. Loss aversion, essentially, it stands for the concept that folks value avoiding losses far more than they value gains. Losses are felt by some estimates they have twice the impact of a similar gain. And when you apply those concepts in a negotiation, what people start to realize is that the certainty of a gain, even if it's not as great as what they could get in their best alternative to a negotiated arrangement, often outweighs the uncertainty of the losses that they could suffer. The human brain is wired to protect, not to pursue. And RECO, this concept that we're talking about today, works because we're built to avoid pain. Humans are built to avoid risk and avoid pain rather than pursue gains. And we see that in everyday life. And we'll talk about some concepts and get you thinking about this a little bit in practical terms. Uh, Here's an idea that I want you to think about. And I use this when I'm trying to explain this to family members. Imagine you're walking down the street and you find $20. Or let's back up. You're walking down the street and you find $10. $10 just laying on the street, and you pick it up, you put it in your pocket, take it home, you're feeling pretty good. Now, go back and let's change that scenario. Let's imagine you're walking down the street and you find $20. You pick up the $20, it's two $10 bills, you put it in your pocket, you walk home, and you get home and you realize when you get home that you lost $10 out of the 20. You're still advanced the same amount. You're still up $10. But people, if they stop and think about how they would feel about that, they feel more disappointment from the loss of the $10 than they do from the gain of the $10 in the first scenario. That's essentially a demonstration of prospect theory and loss aversion. People feel the losses much more than they feel the benefits of a gain. I've used this when I've done live speaking engagements. I have talked to crowds and I'll offer them a bet, and I'll say, and sometimes it's how you frame the offer as well, and we'll talk about that a little bit. And I say, who in the audience would bet me if I put up $10? If I say I'm going to flip a coin, and if the coin comes up heads, you win $10. But if the coin comes up tails, you lose $10 and you have to pay me. And even though it's a 50-50 bet, uh, whenever I've done this in live groups, very few people are willing to take me up on the offer. And I've even expanded it. And the way I frame it is I'll say, all right, I'm going to flip a coin. I'm willing to flip a coin. And if you win, you get $10. But if you lose, you have to dig in your pocket and pull out, or pardon me, if you win, you get $20. But if you lose, you have to dig in your pocket and you have to pull out $10 and give it to me. And the way I frame that, and the idea of making people visualize and think about having to pay $10 for a loss, even though anybody should really take that bet based on the odds. A coin flip, you get $20 for a win, $10 for a loss. Most people still won't take the bet. And I've done this a few times. It's very interesting to see that, again, people hate the idea of losing much more than they enjoy winning. And that imbalance is the key to influencing decision making during the negotiation process. And I use this a lot in my mediation practice to get people focused on, identifying and visualizing the potential losses that they can avoid by coming to an agreement that gives them certainty. So here's another scenario. This is a little audience participation exercise, and I'll give you an opportunity to respond to this. Let's say you have, and think about this, maybe if you have something to write down, write this down. Let's say you have been presented with a $1,000 gift, and you have two options. You can take 500 and keep it, or you can flip a coin, and in that 50-50 coin toss, you get to keep all 1,000, or you get zero. Now, which of those options would you take? Would you take the $500, or would you take the 50-50 scenario where you get $1,000 or you lose zero? Now, second scenario is you have a $2,000 gift. And your options here are that you lose $500 or you give $500 back, or you flip a coin, which is a 50-50 chance. And in that coin toss, you lose $1,000 or you lose zero. So think about which of those options you would take in each one. And I will tell you that in most circumstances, people on the first option would go for the $500 sure thing. And again, that's a demonstration of prospect theory and loss aversion in action. They would rather have the certain $500 than they would risk losing all $1,000. In the second scenario, it's very much the same. If you frame it as a loss of $500 or frame it as a 50-50 loss, people make decisions based on trying to avoid losses. And how you frame those questions can influence decision making. So here's a little discussion on the psychology behind these concepts, RECO and prospect theory and loss aversion. Participants in a study, this is an actual study that was done. Participants in a study were asked to imagine a disease outbreak that was expected to kill 600 people. And they were given the option that they could have program A, where 200 people, there's a potential cure, and 200 people would be saved. In program B, you had a 1/3 possibility that all 600, or 1/3 possibility that all 600 would be saved, and a 2/3 possibility that none would be saved. And which would you choose? Think about this for if you were in a decision-making situation, which one of these would you choose? And as I have here on the slide, 72% choose program A. And the idea is that it focuses on the gain. The 200 people will be saved versus the idea that potentially everybody could be subject to, or where, pardon me, not that everybody would be saved, but 200 people would be saved versus the potential that the risk is presented by program B, the 1/3 possibility or the 2/3 probability where potentially nobody would be saved. And people like certainty. This was a classic study that was done by Kahneman and Tversky, and it shows that, essentially the math here is identical, but it's how the concepts are presented that influences how people make decisions. Now, take the same study, and there's a second group, and here's how the options were framed, and it's a little bit different. They're framed here as losses. So in program C, 400 people will die. In program D, there's a 1/3 probability that none die, and a 2/3 probability that all die. When it was presented this way, think about the last way it was presented. If you present it, let me go back to the last slide. 200 people saved, 1/3 probability that all 600 were saved, or 2/3 probability that none were saved. 72% of folks in this scenario picked the sure 200 people. But then when you frame it as a loss, I'm going to go back to this slide here, where 400 will die, that's a certainty, a certain negative outcome. 400 will die. 1/3 probability that none die, or 2/3 probability that all die. In this scenario, with equal math, again, 78% choose program D. And this is where it's a loss framed outcome. And what the results of this study show, or believed to show in decision making, is that identical math framed differently affects people's risk tolerance. So we can use that. Oh, let me go. I flipped the slide too quick here. I'm going to move away from my mouse and use the arrows instead. We can use that in negotiation, in the way we frame options for counterparts when we're in any type of business negotiation, or when we're in if we're dealing with lawsuits and that type of the risks of litigation. Here's another study, and this involved mug ownership. This was another one that was done by Kahneman and his group. I don't know if it was Kahneman and Tversky or another Kahneman with some other folks. He's done several of these studies. And this is the mug ownership study. In this one, participants were randomly given coffee mugs. Some were given mugs and some were not. And later they were either asked to buy or sell the mugs. And those who were given mugs and who had owned the mug and were asked to sell it were valued the mug at $7. Those who did not own the mug and were asked to buy it valued the mug around $3. And the question is, why is the mug worth more to the person who already owns it versus the person who's asked to pay for it? And this became known as the endowment effect. This is loss aversion at play in everyday behavior. not just in negotiations. People value something that they have and they don't want to give it up as a loss versus having to pay to actually gain it. And it's the same mug. This has been the same scenario has been replicated with ballpoint pens, and the study results don't change. So here's one final. I may have another one behind this, but another example. Think of a utility company offers you a $20 rebate if you submit a form, and in those circumstances, oftentimes people ignore it. So how often do you apply for something like a $20 rebate? If you think about it yourself. Most people tend to ignore it, but if you frame the $20 effect as a penalty if you don't act, the response rate tends to increase and increase dramatically. And the reason for this is that people tend to respond to avoid penalties more than they do uh, for the same amount of a potential reward. This is classic loss aversion in behavioral economics. And what we learned from all of this is that people tend to not only like certainty, but they discount risks they feel they can control and risks they panic over risks they feel they can't control. And that's where RECO gets some traction. We underestimate risks that we think we control, such as investing and gambling, even though how much control do you really have over those? And we overestimate risks of catastrophic outcomes. And if you can make people think about and feel, particularly, I'll use the lawsuit context, because most mediations that I'm involved in involve folks who are either contemplating a lawsuit or find themselves in the middle of a lawsuit and trying to get out of one. Uh, Most often that's what we're looking at. And if you can at least create a realistic picture of what a really bad outcome looks like in that lawsuit, you can leverage that in a mediation over time or in a negotiation to try to reach an alternative outcome and get a settlement. And that's why most cases that go into lawsuits end up being resolved in settlement, because people start thinking about the uncertainty of going in front of a jury, the uncertainty of a judge making decisions, the uncertainty of what discovery will reveal in litigation, the uncertainty of the costs and the time commitment, and how much is going to be involved in the process. And we use all of that to our advantage to try to influence people to move towards settlement. I think I overhit the slide again here. I apologize. Oh, there we go. All right, so RECO works by moving the needle and tapping into the loss aversion mode that people naturally have. And when used properly, and we can't rush the process, but when we apply this concept in negotiation, uh, people tend to become more willing to act the more they focus on what the potential negative outcomes can be. It's not just about exposing risk, but we're engineering clarity. You're not threatening people with outcomes. You're helping them see what their downside risk is clearly enough to care about that and to care to try to avoid it. And so now we're going to talk about steps to apply RECO in negotiation. And the first step is reality testing. Ask the question, what happens if we don't reach a deal? What's the next step if we don't get a settlement today? If we don't get this issue resolved, what are the potential costs? What are the potential time commitments? What's the potential downside of not reaching a settlement? By the way, you can mix this concept with BATNA and explore the best alternative to a negotiated arrangement, the worst alternative to an arrangement, and then reality test your BATNA. You can, oftentimes people say, okay, I'm going to file a lawsuit, I get a judgment, and I'm going to get, I'm suing somebody, I'm going to get $5 million. Well, the most obvious question there is, what is the realistic ability to collect on that judgment, assuming you're able to get a judgment? I use this a lot in helping clients resolve liability cases where insurance is involved. I'm not hired by insurance companies to represent individuals or represent companies in defending, but I have a lot of clients who end up getting sued and they have insurance and there's potential excess liability issues. And in those cases, There comes a point often when we're having a realistic discussion with the plaintiff and the plaintiff's attorneys and asking the question, how do you see this playing out if we don't reach a settlement? If there's $1 million in insurance coverage and you have an opportunity to collect a substantial portion of that in a certain settled arrangement where where you know you're going to get paid, uh, if you don't settle it and you go to litigation, you've got a potential that you could lose, potential maybe exposure to attorney's fees, litigation costs, the time it takes to get there. And then you've got other risks. You think maybe your best alternative is you get a $5 million judgment, but when you walk folks through the realities of trying to collect against individuals when you get beyond the insurance that's available and all the difficulties that are involved in collecting against particularly individual defendants or even company defendants if they're not flush with cash or if they're maybe on the brink of going out of business. And you get into all of those realities, you start testing people's reality and showing them that maybe what they think is their best alternative is not really the best alternative. Maybe the better alternative is presented today, and what they have is really uh, if you give up a settlement today that could give you, let's say, 80% of a particular number that you want, and you hold out for 100%, you get it, and you ultimately are not able to collect it, and it takes you years to get there, is that really a benefit? And when you take time and you dig into those particular issues when you're working with people, uh, again, this isn't something that happens fast in a negotiation, but it happens. And walking through these can be very effective. The next step after reality testing is to create leverage. You're not just selling value, your value. You're trying to help your counterpart or help the party in this negotiation see what they have a possibility of losing, and you want to reorient their sense of urgency. So you're framing what they stand to lose, like we talked about earlier in the examples. What are the potential losses, and help them visualize those losses and then find an alternative to avoid the losses. An example might be in a hospital contract where you're representing a doctor or a doctor group, and you frame the issue with the contract with the hospital, not as a gain of having what the benefits are of your client, but what do they stand to lose if you're not able to negotiate arrangement to bring the services into the hospital? What kind of patient volume, what kind of other effects can it have on the facility? You can use this in all sorts of contexts. And again, something I use often in mediation. You use loss aversion to create leverage. Then, as I've mentioned earlier, you want to not only just speak in vague terms, but be very specific, put numbers to the loss, back it up with data, uh, use tangible consequences to walk through parties, what the costs are of pursuing their current course of action, what the specific costs are if they're not able to reach a deal. Make it tangible and real, and when possible, use authoritative data. Use if you have case studies, if you have actual numbers that you can use as my example here. If projections show that a party could lose $2.3 million over a specific period of time, point that out and ask them, what's the alternative? How do you go back to your interrogatory style questions? How do you tend to replace that loss? How do you plan to cope with that loss if you suffer that loss? Are you prepared to deal with it? And if you are prepared to deal with it, what are going to be the long-term effects after that happens? Making the loss feel real and feel specific has an effect. Vague threats don't motivate action, but in a certain downside risk that you can present and make people realize and feel and visualize can be very effective. And finally, the idea, this is, some folks will recognize some concepts from other negotiation concepts here, the idea of building a golden bridge. You use controlled concessions to have your counterpart or have a party in a negotiation build their way out of a bad scenario, show them what the downside risk looks like, and then help them escape it and phrase it as a mutual gain. Uh, how can we avoid the potential losses that we're looking at today? How can we avoid this catastrophic potential outcome? And use reciprocity, but do it in a controlled manner. Don't just give up something, but couple it with, I like to say, an if-when or if-then statement. If we are able to uh, make one party do this, then would you be willing to do this as well? A lot of folks are often in negotiations, and I see this again, and this where mediation I think is very helpful. Folks are afraid to present an offer or present one scenario because they're afraid that by presenting it, it will make them appear weak or it will make it look like they're willing to make a concession. It's the idea that if let's say we're arguing over $100 and I say, okay, would you take 75? And then the other side says, no, I won't take 75, but I'll take 25. And now you're negotiating in a range between 25 and 75, where you can often use the help of a mediator, an intermediary, or even an if-then statement by saying, I'm not willing to I'm not necessarily willing to move to a middle ground, but if I moved here, then would you do this? And you can use this in all types of scenarios where you're giving up concessions. And the idea is you want to give away, you don't want to give away anything for nothing. You want to offer the other side an opportunity to essentially an off ramp from a bad situation. So you paint the loss, you make them feel the loss, you use reality testing and clarity statements to uh, help the other side see what the potential catastrophic outcome is, and then offer them an off ramp and offer an off ramp that makes sense for both sides, that's a better alternative with the certainty and the benefit that avoids the potential negative outcome. All right, let's talk about a few case studies here. Another statement here that I like: every successful negotiation has a moment of recognition when the cost of no is too real to ignore. And I find that to be very true in many negotiations. So first one here, let's just say you have a business negotiation. You're not in a lawsuit, but yeah, you're dealing with a vendor and they're not willing to move on price. You feel like you're at a stalemate. You need to change the conversation. If the negotiation stays focused on price and the parties are at a stalemate, uh, you risk staying at a stalemate because you haven't shifted the focus anywhere else. So you need to get the counterpart, in this case a vendor, thinking about uh, what the costs are of delays, of not making a deal. What's the cost of a stalemate? Is there potential lost market share or any type of operational disruptions? Whenever you can use specific examples, you try to do that, and you're trying to get the vendor using this realistic exposure to a bad outcome or a catastrophic outcome to compare that against the potential benefits of doing a deal, even if it's not under their ideal terms. So this is something that I deal with a lot, legal settlements, and I've seen this as a party and as a mediator, where plaintiffs often make very what some would describe, I should say, as very unrealistic demands. And when the plaintiff comes into a lawsuit and wants, the sky is the limit type figure, it really helps, I find, in those cases to walk through with those parties uh, what the worst potential outcomes are at trial. Obviously you can go to trial at the end of a case and you can lose, but there's other things that can happen. You can lose, you can have tremendous legal fees, time invested in a lawsuit that doesn't pay out. You can have reputational damage. You can, as I mentioned earlier, you can think you have a win and get a judgment, but that judgment proves difficult to collect. You can think that you have a judgment, but then the judgment is subject to appeal. A case can go up on appeal and last another 12 months, 18, 24 months on appeal, and be sent back for a new trial, not with a reversal of what happened at the lower court. There are all kinds of negative scenarios. And I like to think of this, it's a football term that I heard years ago. Somebody said, when you throw the ball in the air, three things can happen, and two of them are bad: interceptions or incompletions. Well, that's what the way I like to view and walk through with plaintiffs in particular, but parties that are facing trial. What are all the, you think of it as a win-lose, but it's not just a win-lose. There's a lot of other potential possibilities that can happen when you're in litigation. And a lot of those possibilities are bad. If you're the plaintiff, anything that gets you other than what you want, and if it's a monetary demand or something else, anything else is pretty bad for you, including time. If you have to spend 5 or 10 years trying to resolve a situation, depending on what it is, especially if it's non-monetary, the issue may be moot by the time you finally get it decided. And even in monetary claims, $1 million today is worth a heck of a lot more than $1 million 10 years from now. And if it costs you a bunch of time and money to get there, it's not going to be worth as much. In addition, there's all this other potential of things that can happen that can affect what you think is a win, and it doesn't look so great. And presenting all of these different scenarios and making these understandable to a party in a legal settlement context, in my view, can be very effective to then saying, okay, today you have an opportunity to have some control and buy some certainty, even if it's not your best case scenario. It's a lot better than most of the alternatives that we've discussed. So it's almost a RECO by volume type approach, where you look at all the different bad things that can happen and try and come up with a better result. I've dealt with several disputes in my law practice where I represent healthcare providers that have disputes with payers through audits and recoupment claims. And this is a regular part of our practice and a problem that we deal with. I would say, well, it is a problem. It's a problem for providers when they either have a hard time getting paid by payers, or when they have been paid, but then they get audited and now the payer is making a recoupment demand. And for these types of disputes, I often like to get an early discussion with some representatives who have decision-making authority with the payer and talk to them seriously about, what is going to be the end result. Once they realize that, once the payers realize, in my experience, that the provider is not just going to roll over, is not just going to give them everything that they want, and that there's going to be a fight, and then you can help them identify what the potential negative outcomes are. You demonstrate the administrative costs and disruptions and reputational harm and potential regulatory issues, public scrutiny, all of those things that can be leveraged to show a potential very, very bad downside risk to companies, and then come back to, okay, how do we avoid all that? How can we work together to get out of that negative situation? And we highlight these risks and try to reframe the payer's resistance in the cooperation. Again, it doesn't happen right away. It doesn't happen, necessarily in the first call, but we try to lay the groundwork to to make it ultimately effective. I wanted to use an example here of something that wasn't a lawsuit or in the context of a business dispute. And this is a real world application. Some folks may know I do a lot of I'm district general counsel for the Rotary Central Florida District. I see some interesting issues that come up with clubs on the nonprofit level, and I get asked about these sometimes when trying to resolve personality issues. So this is not taken from any particular scenario. I just totally made this up. But here's a scenario where, let's say you have a nonprofit board that's got some internal conflict going on. There's different folks that have different ideas about what direction a board should take. And there's an influential board member who's been challenging leadership decisions and questioning the executive director's vision of where the organization should go. And this is creating a lot of tension, a lot of problems. And some board members are talking to the executive director, and there's some discussion about asking this person to resign. But consider the benefits and the potential loss, and if there's any other way to potentially resolve this. And so if we apply RECO in this scenario, instead of confronting the director directly and saying, can or asking for that person's resignation, maybe you want to have a discussion and say, hey, can I share a concern that I have? And this would be coming probably from the executive director. You say, look, and preface it, brace the person for the negative, make them think that what you're going to say is a lot more negative than what it is. This is a concept that comes from Chris Voss, to sort of, brace somebody. If you're going to deliver bad news or challenging news, let the people know that what's coming, and they'll have some thoughts maybe in their head, and maybe it won't be quite as bad. Say, look, you may not like what I'm about to say, but I need to say this, and I'm worried if we continue down this path, we're going to lose unity and momentum, and we could lose the support of key donors as they watch all of these this internal conflict unfold. And then, back to our steps of how to apply this. Paint a real picture for this person so that they can see, what the potential outcome is. And public, public board division can lead to donor concerns. Internal morale could decline on the board and in the organization. You could have an increase in board turnover. A lot of these seats, some of them don't pay at all, or pay very, very small amounts. A lot of nonprofit boards, you don't get paid anything. So, board continuity and participation is important. And strategic initiatives for the organization could be stalled as a result if all of these other things happen. And if all of that happens, what's going to happen to this particular director and their influence, not only in the organization, but their influence outside the organization, depending on what they do or what they plan to move on to. If they've got a position of influence now and the board falls apart, it's going to directly affect them. So if you can paint a picture that shows that the problems that the board is having could also lead to challenges for that particular director, you're painting what is a very realistic expectation of a catastrophic outcome if things don't change. And so you can change it and once you show that downside, now paint a different picture and sell a version of the future where you maybe put that person in charge of a subcommittee on some particular project, or get them involved in a way that reduces the conflict and get them buying into some of the decisions or a key decision of the director in order to avoid the potential downside of losing influence, of losing the benefits of sitting in a position of influence on this board. And you want that person to experience the potential reputational harm, potential loss of influence, and become a proponent of the organization's new strategy. So, as a takeaway here, I want you to think about the idea that consequences have value in negotiation. When you are trying to persuade, talking about how good your position is oftentimes goes in one ear out the other. Talking about your own BATNA and using that as leverage with a counterpart in my experience, does not have much influence, because parties are concerned about they have their own concerns, and their own concerns are focused on avoiding loss, and only after they're able to avoid loss, then focusing on potential gain. And so this statement that I have here, that good negotiators trade in numbers, great negotiators trade in consequences. It's kind of the idea of interest-based negotiation over positional-based negotiation. You see that in the Getting the Yes and Urey and Fisher. But interests here are avoiding losses, avoiding negative outcomes. And you're not using RECO. It's not about manipulation. It's just about helping the other side make very informed decisions based on truly realistic, catastrophic, and bad outcomes. Moving into our final thoughts here, RECO is used to help shift the focus from a BATNA style focus to one that helps people focus on what they think about naturally as humans, the way the human brain is wired, preventing loss and using that first before seeking gain. Um, use the details of potential downside risk to make catastrophic potential outcomes feel real, and create a vision with that in your negotiations. And don't think of it as fear-based negotiation, but think of it as informed decision making. As the slide says on the slide here, numbers inform, but consequences and potential negative outcomes, that's what moves people. With that, we finished up a little bit early today. I'm happy to take any questions from our audience there. I'm looking up on the slides. I hope you found this informative. Uh, if you have any questions that come to mind afterwards and you'd like to talk about this a little bit more, or any other concepts, you can feel free to reach out to me on as the information on the slide here, which is my email address, my phone number, and you can look at the website for forsterbowman.com or the website for bowmanmediation.com. And with that, I'm going to call it a day. So thank you again for joining us, and have a great rest of your day.